The glass of bourbon in his hand caught the light from the chandelier, a perfect amber teardrop. He swirled it, the ice clinking softly, the only sound in the sudden silence that had fallen over the dining table. My father, Richard Matthews, the man whose approval I had spent a lifetime chasing, looked down the long mahogany table, his eyes sweeping past me as if I were a ghost. "Eliza has always been focused on proving something," he said, his voice smooth and contemplative, yet carrying a weight that landed directly in my gut, rather than building something. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, a public indictment. Some people chase accomplishments to fill other voids. Family requires compromise. It requires a certain understanding of one's place. It's something the Matthews women, and here his eyes briefly, cruelly met mine, have traditionally understood better than she has. The air was sucked from my lungs. Every head at that table of 20, family, business associates, people who had known me since I was a child, was turned towards me. I could feel their pity, their curiosity, their discomfort. It was a clean shot, a perfectly executed character assassination delivered with the casual disregard of a man swatting a fly. And in that moment, something inside me, a fragile thing I had been holding together with hope and denial for 32 years, finally, irrevocably, shattered. The expensive dress I wore suddenly felt like a costume. The promotion I'd worked myself to the bone for felt like a pathetic trinket. The brand new Mercedes S-Class I had bought him, parked so proudly out front, felt like the most expensive joke in the world. All of it was just scaffolding for a building that had no foundation. He was right. I had been trying to fill a void. The void that he, my own father, had carved into me. But what he didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that in my purse, nestled next to my wallet, was an envelope. And inside that envelope was a truth that would not just fill the void, but demolish the entire rotten structure of our family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that single, quiet moment at a family dinner could break a person, you need to understand the 32 years that led up to it. My name is Eliza Matthews, and this is the story of how I stopped trying to earn a love that was never mine to begin with. Growing up in a sprawling colonial house in a wealthy Boston suburb, our family looked like a page out of a catalog for the American dream. From the outside, we were the Matthews. Richard, the self-made real estate titan. Caroline, his elegant, socially graceful wife. James, the golden boy heir apparent. Sophia, the charming, peacemaking daughter. And me, Eliza, the other one. The overachiever. The one who was always trying just a little too hard. Behind the perfectly manicured hedges and the gleaming front door, things were different. My father, Richard, was the sun around which our entire family system orbited. His moods dictated the emotional weather of our home. He was a man who equated success with worth, and he measured success in dollars, status, and public respect. He'd come from a family with moderate means and had clawed his way to the top, building his real estate development company into a multi-million-dollar empire. He never let us forget it. He saw the world as a battlefield, and he was raising soldiers, not children. From my earliest memories, our relationship was defined by a series of impossible hurdles. When I brought home a report card with 5 A's and 1 B+, he'd circle the B+ in red ink. "What happened here, Eliza?" He'd ask, not with curiosity, but with a disappointment that felt like a physical weight. "Did you get lazy? Second place is just the first loser." I was 7, School plays, parent-teacher conferences, soccer games, those were things for other dads. My father's presence was felt not in the audience, but in the interrogation that followed. Why weren't you chosen for the lead role? Why didn't you score the winning goal? His questions weren't meant to encourage. They were meant to chisel away at any pride I might have felt, to remind me that my best was never quite good enough. My mother, Caroline, was a different story, at least when he wasn't around. She was warm, affectionate, the kind of mother who would bake cookies on a rainy day and read stories aloud with different voices for each character. But the moment my father's car pulled into the driveway, she would transform. It was like watching a light dim. She'd straighten her posture, her voice would become quieter, and her eyes would dart to his face before she answered even the simplest questions. "What's for dinner, Caroline?" He'd ask, and she'd hesitate, as if running through a mental checklist of his preferences and potential criticisms. She never, ever contradicted him. She never stood up for us when his critiques turned from harsh to cruel. I used to resent her for it, for her silence, for what I saw as weakness. It took me years, far too many years, to understand that she was just as much a victim of his suffocating control as the rest of us. She was just better at surviving it. My siblings and I each developed our own coping mechanisms. My older brother, James, was 3 years my senior and from birth was cast in the role of the golden child. He was effortlessly charming, athletic, and academically gifted. He went to our father's alma mater, joined the right fraternity, dated girls from families our father approved of, and slid seamlessly into a high-level position at Matthew's development after graduation. It was like he had been given a playbook for pleasing our father, while I was left guessing every move. Father would clap James on the back for a B in a difficult class, telling him, "That's a tough professor, son. Well done." The B on my report card was a sign of failure. The double standard was so blatant, so deeply woven into the fabric of our family, that for a long time I thought it was normal. I thought the problem was me. My younger sister, Sophia, who was 2 years behind me, was the family's diplomat. She wasn't an overachiever like James or me, but she possessed a remarkable emotional intelligence. She knew how to read the room, how to crack a joke to diffuse my father's dark moods, how to slip into the background when his critical gaze started to wander. She was the one who would sneak into my room after he had torn apart my latest school project or athletic performance. "He doesn't mean it, Liz," she'd whisper, using my childhood nickname. "It's just how he is." She'd sit on the edge of my bed until I stopped crying, her quiet presence a small anchor in the storm of my father's disapproval. Her kindness was genuine, but it also served to normalize the toxicity. We weren't supposed to question it, we were just supposed to manage it. I, on the other hand, chose defiance, or at least what I thought was defiance. I decided that if I couldn't earn his love, I would command his respect. I became a machine of achievement. I graduated at the top of my high school class. I earned a full academic scholarship to Cornell. This, I thought, would surely be enough. But my father had wanted me to attend his alma mater, just like James. He saw my choice not as an achievement, but as a personal slight, a rejection of the path he had laid out. During my college breaks, while other kids were relaxing, I worked 2 part-time jobs and maintained a near-perfect GPA. His only comment, "Why aren't you interning at a more prestigious company? Goldman Sachs. JP Morgan. You're not thinking big enough, Eliza." After graduation, he made a half-hearted offer for me to join the family business. "We can find a spot for you in accounting, I suppose," he'd said, as if doing me a favor. I knew what that meant. I would be a pity hire, a constant reminder of my failure to be James. I would never be seen as competent in my own right. So, I said no. I packed 2 suitcases, took the few $1,000s I had saved, and moved to New York City. I slept on a friend's couch for 6 weeks, eating ramen noodles and pounding the pavement, sending my resume to every financial firm in the city. When I finally landed an entry-level analyst position at Goldman Sachs, I called home, my voice trembling with pride. I could practically hear my father's shrug over the phone. "Goldman, huh?" He said. "Let's see if you last a month." That comment became the fuel that powered my entire career. I didn't just last a month, I lasted 8 years. I worked longer hours, took on the toughest projects, and climbed the corporate ladder with a relentless determination that was fueled by 90% ambition and 10% pure, unadulterated spite. I wasn't just building a career, I was building a case. I was assembling evidence, piece by painstaking piece, to prove him wrong. Every promotion, every bonus, every successful deal was another exhibit in the silent trial I was prosecuting in my own mind. Just a few months before that fateful reunion dinner, I received the biggest promotion of my life. I was made a senior investment strategist, the youngest person in my firm's history to hold the position. It came with a staggering salary and a bonus that made me dizzy just looking at the number of zeros. For the first time, I felt a sense of real security. I bought my dream apartment in Manhattan, a beautiful 2-bedroom with a view of the Hudson River. And I still had a significant amount of money left over. That's when the idea formed, a grand, foolish, desperate idea. I was going to buy his approval. I knew, even then, how pathetic it was. But the little girl inside me, the one who just wanted her dad to say, "I'm proud of you," was still calling the shots. My father had once mentioned, in a rare moment of unguarded admiration, a friend's new Mercedes S-Class. He'd talked about the engine, the handcrafted interior, the sheer presence of the car. So I decided that would be it. I would buy him the car. It cost me nearly a full year's salary, a figure that made my hands shake when I signed the check. But I convinced myself it would be worth it. This gift, I thought, was too big to be dismissed, too impressive to be criticized. This would be the gesture that finally broke through his armor. Looking back, it's painfully clear. I wasn't buying a luxury car. I was trying to buy the one thing every child deserves for free: a parent's unconditional love. But there was another secret I was holding, one that had completely upended my understanding of my own life. About 3 months earlier, on a whim, I had done one of those popular genetic testing kits. I was curious about my ancestry, hoping to find some interesting tidbits about my European heritage. I spit in the tube, mailed it off, and mostly forgot about it. When the results came back, I clicked through the ancestry percentages without much thought. But then I saw a section on genetic relatives. The service had connected me with a few distant cousins, which was interesting. But it was a smaller, more clinical section on DNA markers that caught my eye. It was filled with technical jargon I didn't understand, but one line stood out: a comparison of my X chromosome markers to a standard paternal lineage database. There was a flag, an anomaly. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I spent the next week falling down an internet rabbit hole, learning about haplogroups, Y-DNA, and mitochondrial DNA. The more I read, the more the dread grew into a terrifying suspicion. It just wasn't possible. It was a mistake, a lab error, but I couldn't shake it. The feeling of being an outsider in my own family, a feeling I'd carried my whole life, suddenly took on a new, sinister meaning. The subtle physical differences I'd always ignored. My finer bone structure, my lighter eyes compared to the dark, intense gaze of my father and James, suddenly seemed glaring. The inexplicable coldness from him, the way he looked at me differently than he looked at Sophia and James, it all started to click into place in a way that made me feel sick. I had to know for sure. I couldn't live with the uncertainty. During a brief, obligatory visit home for my mother's birthday, I did something I'm not proud of. While my father was out playing golf, I went into his bathroom. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I opened his drawer and took the hairbrush he used every morning. I carefully plucked a few strands of hair, making sure the roots were attached, and sealed them in a small plastic bag I'd brought in my purse. I felt like a criminal, a spy in my own home. I found an independent lab online, one that specialized in discrete paternity testing, and I sent in the samples along with my own. The 2 weeks I waited for the results were the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus at work. Every interaction, every memory, was now cast in a shadow of doubt. When the email finally arrived with the subject line, "Your private DNA test results," I stared at it for a full 10 minutes before I could bring myself to click. I downloaded the attached PDF. My hands were trembling so badly I had to set my phone down on my desk. The report was clinical, sterile. A series of charts and percentages, but at the bottom, the conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The alleged father, Richard Matthews, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Eliza Matthews. The probability of paternity is 0%. I read the words over and over again. 0%, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a fact. Richard Matthews, the man whose approval I had spent my entire life desperately trying to win, was not my father. The first emotion wasn't anger or sadness. It was a strange, hollow sense of vindication. It was a quiet, devastating, I knew it. I knew there was a reason. I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew the rejection I felt was real and had a source. The source wasn't that I was unworthy. The source was that I wasn't his. The shock gave way to a tidal wave of questions. My mother, how? When? Who? Did my father know? He had to know. That was the only explanation that made sense. He must have known from the beginning, and that knowledge had poisoned every single interaction we'd ever had. My entire life, my entire childhood, was a lie. I wasn't a disappointing daughter. I was a living, breathing symbol of my mother's betrayal. I printed the report, sealed it in a plain white envelope, and put it in my purse. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. It felt like a nuclear bomb, a weapon of last resort. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately, to blow the whole facade of our perfect family to smithereens. But another part of me was terrified. What would it accomplish? It wouldn't change the past. It would only cause unimaginable pain for my mother and for Sophia, who adored our father. So the envelope stayed in my purse. A secret weapon, a ticking clock. And as the date of the annual family reunion approached, the reunion that was always held on the last weekend of June, conveniently close to Father's Day, the weight of that envelope and the weight of the brand new Mercedes I had just bought felt like they were going to crush me. This year's reunion wouldn't just be a celebration of Richard Matthews, the patriarch. It would be a collision of my last, desperate attempt to win his affection and the terrible truth that explained why I never could. The anxiety leading up to that weekend was a physical thing. It was a tightness in my chest, a constant, low-grade hum of dread. I spent 3 separate weekends shopping for the perfect outfit, a ritual I hated myself for but couldn't stop. I needed something that screamed successful, but not in a way that seemed like I was trying too hard. It had to be feminine but not frivolous. It had to be expensive but not flashy. It was an impossible set of contradictions, a sartorial reflection of the impossible standards I was always trying to meet. I finally settled on a navy blue tailored dress from a designer my mother had once mentioned my father respected. I paired it with subtle gold jewelry and a pair of heels that were expensive enough to be noticed, but quiet enough not to be criticized. The entire process felt pathetic, the desperate, calculated routine of a 32-year-old woman still dressing for her father's approval. The day before the reunion, I drove the new Mercedes from the dealership to my parents' house. I de-arranged the delivery specifically for that afternoon, timing it so my mother would be at her weekly garden club meeting. I wanted a private moment with him, a clean stage for my grand gesture. My heart was pounding as I pulled into the familiar, long driveway and parked the gleaming black sedan right in front of the door. He answered the door in his usual Saturday uniform, crisp chinos and a perfectly pressed polo shirt. He looked more annoyed than curious at the interruption. "Eliza, you're early," he said, glancing at his Rolex as if I'd missed a scheduled appointment. "The reunion isn't until tomorrow." "I know, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I wanted to bring your Father's Day gift a day early, and I wanted to give it to you privately." I handed him a small, elegant box. He opened it with that polite, detached air he usually reserved for obligatory gifts from business acquaintances. His eyebrows shot up as he saw the 3-pointed star of the Mercedes-Benz emblem on the key fob. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Shock, pleasure. It was there for a second, then gone, replaced by his default setting of analytical suspicion. I just smiled and gestured towards the driveway. "Happy Father's Day." He walked to the window, and for a solid minute, he just stared at the car. The brand-new, top-of-the-line S-Class gleaming in the afternoon sun. I saw his jaw tighten. He walked to the front door, key in hand, without another word. I followed him outside, my hands clammy. "This is excessive, Eliza," he said, but he was already walking towards it, his steps quickening. "What are you trying to prove?" "Nothing," I lied, my voice sounding thin. "I got a big promotion, and I wanted to do something special for you. You deserve it." He didn't respond. He circled the car twice, like a property inspector assessing a new building. He ran his hand along the fender, his expression unreadable. He opened the driver's side door and slid inside, his fingers tracing the leather on the steering wheel. He spent 10 minutes just sitting in the car, pushing buttons, adjusting the mirrors, exploring the infotainment system. He didn't invite me in. Finally, he started the engine. The low, powerful rumble filled the quiet suburban street. "The steering feels a bit loose," he commented after a brief test drive around the block, a critique of a car renowned for its flawless handling. When he returned, he didn't leave it in the driveway. He pulled it straight into the garage next to his older but still perfectly respectable BMW. He parked it out of sight. His thanks when it finally came was perfunctory. "Well, thank you, Eliza." You must be doing very well to be able to waste money like this. And that was it. He turned and went back inside, leaving me standing alone in the driveway, the echo of his words hanging in the air. Waste money. Not what an incredible gift. Not I can't believe you did this. Not even a simple, heartfelt thank you. He had managed to take my grand gesture, the most extravagant gift I had ever given anyone, and turn it into another criticism, another mark against me. That night in my sterile hotel room, I called my best friend, Taylor. She was the only person in the world who knew the whole story, including the results of the DNA test. I recounted the entire, humiliating episode, my voice thick with tears I refused to let fall. "You know what? Forget him," Taylor said, her voice full of the righteous, protective anger that only a true friend can muster. "Lisa, he's a black hole for validation. Nothing will ever be enough. Take the car back. Seriously. Call the dealership tomorrow and tell them you changed your mind. He doesn't deserve it." "I can't," I whispered, though I knew she was right. A pathetic, stubborn sliver of hope remained. Maybe tomorrow, in front of the whole family, he'd be different. Maybe he'd show it off. Maybe then he would finally acknowledge me. "Just promise me one thing," Taylor said, her voice serious. "Don't show him that envelope. Not unless you are 100% ready for the nuclear fallout. Do not detonate that bomb out of anger or hurt. You do it on your terms when you're ready. Promise me." "I promise," I said, but even as I said it, I could feel the sharp corners of the envelope through the leather of my purse. It felt less like a secret and more like a destiny I was carrying around with me. Sunday arrived, a perfect, picturesque New England June day. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the giant maple trees that lined my parents' long, winding driveway. It was the kind of day that made you believe in illusions, in the possibility of a perfect family gathering. As I drove to their estate, I rehearsed my lines. I prepared confident, breezy answers for the inevitable questions about my career, my love life, my baffling decision to remain unmarried and childless at the ripe old age of 32. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel of my own, much more modest, car. When I turned into the driveway, my stomach lurched. There it was, the Mercedes. He had moved it. It was no longer hidden away in the garage. It was parked prominently at the end of the circular drive, right near the front entrance, positioned so that every single guest who arrived would have to walk right past it. For a wild, hopeful second, my heart soared. He was showing it off. He was proud. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my navy blue dress, and forced a confident smile onto my face. I was Eliza Matthews, senior investment strategist. I could handle a boardroom full of condescending men. I could certainly handle my own family. I walked towards the imposing front door, the sound of cheerful chatter already spilling out. My mother answered, her face lighting up with a genuine warmth that was both a comfort and a pang of sadness. "Eliza, darling, you look beautiful," she whispered, pulling me into a hug that smelled faintly of her signature Chanel No. 5. Then, in a lower voice, she added, "Your father is in the back garden with the Peterson group." It was her standard weather warning, a gentle heads-up about the location of the storm front. The grand foyer was already buzzing with people. The annual reunion was less a family gathering and more a carefully curated networking event for my father. There were aunts and uncles and cousins, of course, but they were outnumbered by his business associates, his lawyer, his accountant, and a handful of local politicians. These were the people he considered his true family, the clan of success. My Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, descended on me immediately with air kisses and a rapid-fire interrogation about my romantic prospects. My Uncle George clapped me on the shoulder with a booming, "There's our Wall Street wizard," a nickname I knew would grate on my father if he heard it. The room swirled in a familiar dance of polite inquiries and feigned interest. Then, my father made his entrance. He walked in from the back garden, flanked by Walter Peterson, his longtime business rival, and two other men in expensive suits. They were all laughing at something he'd said, laughing a little too hard, the way people do around a man they want something from. His eyes scanned the room, offering brief, regal nods to his guests. His gaze passed over me, flickered with recognition for a split second, and then moved on without a change in expression. He gave me the same cursory nod he'd given a second cousin I hadn't seen in 5 years. Then he walked straight to my mother and murmured something in her ear. No hug. No, hello, Eliza. No acknowledgement of the daughter who had just gifted him a 6-figure automobile. I felt the familiar sting of it, the quiet, public dismissal. I turned away, pretending to be engrossed in a conversation with my cousin Rachel about her grueling medical residency. A moment later, my mother materialized at my side, her hand gently touching my arm. It was her signature move, the socialite's damage control. "Darling," she said, her voice bright and a little strained. "Your father mentioned you brought a new car for him. How incredibly generous of you." Her eyes, however, held a different message, a mixture of gratitude and a subtle anxiety about the sheer extravagance of the gift. "Please come say hello to the Stevensons. They just got back from a financial conference in Singapore and would love to hear your insights." And just like that, I was swept away, my mother using me as a social asset, creating a buffer, manufacturing an interaction that should have come naturally. James arrived, fashionably late as always, with his perfect wife, Rebecca, and their 2 perfect children in tow. He strode in like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did. My father's face lit up. He walked over and gave James a warm, 2-armed embrace, the kind I'd spent my entire life starving for. "Dad, that new car out front is insane," James said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "When did you decide to upgrade?" I stood frozen just a few feet away, watching in utter disbelief as my father clapped him on the shoulder, a proud smile spreading across his face. "Well, son," he said, his voice booming for all to hear, "sometimes you just have to treat yourself. Success has its privileges." Not a single word, not a glance in my direction, no mention of the gift, of my contribution. He had erased me from the narrative completely. He was taking full credit for it. The hope I had so foolishly clung to evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening rage. Before I could react, before the fury could register on my face, Sophia intercepted me. She pulled me into a hug that was tight and real, lingering just long enough to communicate that she had seen the whole exchange. "I heard about your promotion," she whispered in my ear, using my childhood nickname. "That's amazing, Liz. Seriously. Groundbreaking." Her sincerity was a balm on a raw wound, but the stark contrast with our father's behavior only made his cruelty more pronounced. As the afternoon wore on and the hired staff circulated with silver trays of appetizers, I saw my father lead a group of his business cronies towards the front of the house. I watched through the large bay window as he gestured animatedly towards the Merceds. He was giving them a tour. He opened the doors, pointed out the features, his face alive with a pride and excitement I had never, not once, seen him direct at me. "He's been doing that all morning," Sophia murmured, appearing at my elbow with a glass of white wine, which I took gratefully. "This is the third group he's taken on a grand tour. Mom told me you bought it for him." That was incredibly generous, Liz. I took a large sip of the wine, the cold liquid doing nothing to cool the fire in my chest. I watched as my father settled into the driver's seat, inviting Walter Peterson to experience the supple leather of the passenger side. He was performing, holding court, using my gift as a prop in the theater of his own success. Generosity wasn't the motivation, I admitted to Sophia, my voice quiet and bitter. I just wanted him to see me, to see that I was successful, that I was worthy of his notice. How pathetic is that? Sophia squeezed my arm, her expression full of a sad understanding that went beyond words. "It's not pathetic, Liz. It's human," she said softly. "But you need to understand something. Dad is never going to give you what you're looking for. It's not because of you. It's not because you don't deserve it. It's because he can't. Something in him it's broken, specifically when it comes to you." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't new information, not really. I had known it, deep down, for years. But to hear someone else say it, to have the dynamic I had lived my entire life with articulated so clearly, made it real in a way my own private thoughts never could. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact, validated by an outside observer. The weight of the envelope in my purse seemed to double. The sealed truth was a ticking bomb, and I was starting to feel the desperate, terrifying urge to light the fuse. The hour before dinner was a masterclass in our family's dysfunction. We all migrated to the formal living room, a space so perfectly decorated and preserved it felt more like a museum exhibit than a room for living. I found a seat on a window bench, slightly removed from the main circle of conversation, nursing my second glass of wine and observing the scene with a new, chilling sense of detachment. The knowledge of my genetic otherness was like a pane of glass between me and them. I wasn't one of them. I was an anthropologist studying a strange, foreign tribe. James, naturally, held the floor. He was regaling the room with the story of his latest real estate conquest. A struggling shopping plaza he planned to demolish and redevelop into luxury condominiums. "The initial investment looked risky to my partners," he explained, his voice confident and easy, "but I saw the potential everyone else missed." My father, seated in his throne-like leather armchair, nodded approvingly. "That's the Matthews instinct," he interjected, his voice thick with pride. "Seeing opportunity where others only see failure. It's in our blood." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. It's in our blood. My hand instinctively went to my purse, my fingers brushing against the stiff edge of the envelope. With every word he spoke, the urge to stand up and shout, "Oh, is it? Let's talk about blood, shall we?" grew stronger. The conversation, as it always did, eventually turned to me. It was my Uncle Robert who threw the conversational ball in my direction. "Eliza, Richard tells me you've moved up at your firm," he said with what sounded like genuine interest. "Senior investment strategist, isn't it? That's damned impressive for someone your age." A brief, expectant silence fell over the room. This was it. A perfect opening for my father to say something, anything, positive. To acknowledge my success on his own terms. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, he cleared his throat. "It's a good stepping stone position," he said, his tone dismissive. He turned his body slightly, angling himself away from me and towards James. The financial sector is volatile, though, always has been. It's not like having something tangible, like property. He looked directly at James. Real assets, they withstand market fluctuations. They persist through generations. He had done it again. In one smooth, calculated move, he had dismissed my achievement, minimized my field, and pivoted the conversation right back to his favored son. It was so expertly done, it was almost artistic in its cruelty. Summoning the cool, professional voice I used in tense client meetings, I decided not to let it slide. Actually, I began, my voice clear and steady. My division generated 38% returns last quarter, outperforming the market by 22 points during a period of significant volatility. And the risk assessment model I developed has just been adopted company-wide. A flicker of impressed silence passed through the room. My uncle looked genuinely taken aback, but my father just gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Numbers on a piece of paper. When the next big recession hits, we'll see how well that model holds up. He then turned to Henry, one of his business associates, and said, "Speaking of property values, Henry, what are your thoughts on the new zoning changes in the Cambridge corridor?" I was erased. The conversation moved on as if I hadn't spoken. I stood up, murmuring an excuse about needing to refresh my drink, and made my way out of the living room. My hands were shaking. In the hallway, I ran into Sophia, who was coming from the kitchen. "Don't let him get to you," she whispered, squeezing my arm. "For what it's worth, my friend Michael's cousin works in your building, and he said everyone is talking about your new model. He said it's revolutionary." Her support was a tiny life raft in a sea of bile. But the fact that I needed it, that I was a 32-year-old woman being consoled by her little sister because her father was being cruel, was just so deeply, profoundly pathetic. As I approached the bar set up in the dining room, I heard my father's voice drifting from his adjoining study. The door was slightly ajar. He was talking to Walter Peterson, his rival. Curiosity, or perhaps masochism, made me stop and listen. "The car? Yes, quite an upgrade from the old model," my father was saying, his voice full of casual pride. "When you work as hard as I have, when you build something from nothing, you earn these little luxuries." Walter Peterson's voice, smoother and more polished, replied, "Oh, come on, Richard, you old dog, always so modest. Your daughter Eliza was just telling me she bought it for you. A gift for her promotion," she said. "Sounds like she's making quite a name for herself in New York." There was a brief, loaded pause. I held my breath. Then my father's response, each word chosen with chilling precision. "Yes, well, the girl has always been desperate for attention. The truth is, her success comes from the opportunities I provided. The private schools, the college connections, the fundamental understanding of business that I instilled in all my children. This car," he chuckled, a low, condescending sound, "is just her way of finally showing that she's applying the lessons I taught her." A shock of pure, white-hot anger shot through me. It was so intense I nearly dropped my glass. He wasn't just taking credit for the car. He was taking credit for my entire life. Every late night at the office, every sacrifice, every ounce of grit and determination I had poured into building my career. He was casually, arrogantly, claiming it all as his own creation. He was painting himself as the wise, benevolent architect of a success he had done nothing but try to sabotage at every turn. I backed away from the door before he could discover me, my heart hammering against my ribs. The anger was so pure, so clarifying. It burned away all the hurt and the desperate hope, leaving behind only a cold, hard fury. Everything became crystal clear. Sophia was wrong. He wasn't broken. He was cruel. And his cruelty towards me wasn't random or unthinking. It was deliberate. It was personal. And now I knew why. As I stood in the hallway, trying to compose myself, James appeared at my side, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Eliza, a word," he said, his tone low and urgent. He guided me to a quiet corner of the foyer near a display of my mother's prized orchids. "Dad mentioned you've been asking Mom some strange questions," he began, his eyes narrowed. "Questions about her life before she met him, about her college years. What exactly are you digging for?" His directness caught me off guard. After the DNA results, I had, in fact, gently probed my mother during a phone call, asking about her life in the early 70s, trying to fish for clues about old boyfriends or relationships she'd never mentioned. I thought I'd been subtle. Clearly, I hadn't been subtle enough. "I'm just getting to know her better," I said, choosing my words carefully. Women of her generation didn't get many opportunities to build their own identities before they were wives and mothers. I was just curious. James studied me with our father's piercing, analytical gaze. The family resemblance between them was so strong, and now it felt like a brand, a mark of a tribe I didn't belong to. "Look," he said, stepping a little closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Whatever you think you're doing, just stop. The big, dramatic gift, the weird questions, you're disrupting things. This family has a certain order, a harmony. Don't come in here and start manufacturing a crisis just because you're having one." The condescension, so perfectly parroted from our father, was breathtaking. I almost laughed. "Harmony." I shot back, my own voice low and shaking with rage. "Is that what you call this? This toxic hierarchy? This sick system where one person is put on a pedestal and another is constantly undermined? I'm not manufacturing anything, James. I'm just finally seeing things clearly." He took another step closer, his face hardening. "Dad built everything we have. The Matthews name means something in this city because of him. Your fancy job in New York, your trendy apartment, it all exists because of the foundation he laid. So how about you show a little bit of respect, a little bit of gratitude for once in your life?" Before I could unleash the torrent of furious words bubbling up inside me, our cousin Rachel appeared, her expression concerned. "Everything okay over here?" she asked, sensing the tension. "Aunt Caroline is looking for you too. I think dinner is about to be announced." James immediately plastered his public smile back on his face, the transition seamless and sickening. "Just catching up with my little sister," he said breezily. "A little business talk. Nothing important." He gave me a final, warning look before turning and walking away. Rachel touched my arm gently. "You know," she said quietly, "my mom always says your dad plays favorites like it's an Olympic sport, and he's determined to win the gold. For what it's worth, I think what you've accomplished, all on your own, is pretty damn incredible." Her simple, unsolicited kindness nearly broke me. For so many years, I'd been gaslit into believing the problem was my perception, not the reality. Having someone else in the family, even a cousin, acknowledge the truth of it was both incredibly validating and profoundly devastating. Just then, the gentle chime of a small bell echoed through the house. It was my mother's signal. Dinner was served. Everyone began to move towards the formal dining room. I hung back for a moment, my hand on my purse. The envelope inside felt like it was burning a hole through the leather. I weighed my options. I could leave. I could just walk out the front door, get in my car, and drive back to New York, back to my life, and never look back. It would be the sane, self-preserving thing to do. But as I stood there, the image of my father's smug face, the sound of his dismissive voice, the memory of James telling me to know my place, it all coalesced into a single, unshakable resolve. I was done being dismissed. I was done being erased. I was done being silent. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed down my dress one last time, and walked towards the dining room, not as a guest, but as a reckoning. The dining room was my father's stage. The long, imposing mahogany table, the judgmental ancestral portraits, the elaborate place settings, it was all designed to project an image of power, legacy, and unshakable order. My name card was, predictably, positioned at the far end of the table, in the cheap seats, seated between Rachel's quiet husband and one of my father's junior business associates. James and his family were in the seats of honor, flanking my father at the head of the table. My mother sat at the opposite end, a perfect visual metaphor for her role. Technically his equal, but separated by a vast, unbridgeable distance. The meal began. Father stood and gave his annual toast, a polished speech about legacy, family, and the virtues of building something that lasts. His eyes swept proudly over James, then Sophia, and then slid right past me as if my chair were empty. The dinner conversation was an orchestra he conducted, raising and lowering his voice, pointing with his wine glass to select who would speak next. He kept the topics safely within his domain: real estate, local politics, and James's former football triumphs. Every time the conversation threatened to drift towards something I might have an expert opinion on, he would smoothly redirect it. When my mother tried to mention my promotion, he cut her off to ask Henry Peterson about interest rates. He lobbed periodic questions at me down the length of the table, each one a carefully disguised missile designed to undermine. "Eliza, your firm handles primarily domestic investments, correct? A bit limiting, isn't it, given the global opportunities? I understand your promotion came after the firm landed the Davidson account. Fortunate timing that James was able to introduce you to William Davidson at last year's charity gala, wasn't it?" I parried each attack with cool professionalism, correcting his inaccurate assumptions with facts. "Actually, Father, my risk model was just integrated by our international division," I'd say with a polite smile. "And the Davidson account was won through a blind pitch competition. No introductions were involved." I could see Sophia wince with each exchange. I could feel my mother's anxious energy from the other end of the table. The whole performance was suffocating, a slow, methodical execution by 1,000 tiny cuts. And then came the final blow. It was dessert. Coffee had been served. The mood was winding down. Mrs. Peterson, with the well-meaning but clueless air of a woman who has never had to work for anything, turned to me. "Eliza, your father tells me you're still single. Such a beautiful, accomplished young woman. The men in New York must be terribly intimidated." Before I could formulate a polite, non-committal response, my father's voice, slick with bourbon and condescension, cut through the air. And that's when he said it, the words that finally broke me. "Eliza has always been focused on proving something rather than building something. Some people chase accomplishments to fill other voids." The world seemed to slow down. The clinking of spoons against porcelain, the low hum of conversation, it all faded away. All I could hear was his voice, echoing in the cavernous space where my self-worth used to be. All I could see were the faces staring at me, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the head of his table, in the center of his universe, a king in his castle of lies. And I felt nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. The desperate, lifelong yearning for his love was gone. All that was left was a vast, cold emptiness. And in that emptiness, a decision took root. I calmly placed my napkin on the table. My hands were perfectly steady. I reached into my purse and took out the plain white envelope. The air in the room crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. Every eye was on me. I looked down the length of the table, my gaze meeting my mother S. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. She knew what was in the envelope. She didn't know how I knew, but she knew. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. A silent, desperate plea. Don't. I ignored her. My eyes moved to James, his face a mask of confusion and annoyance. Then to Sophia, her expression full of a terrified concern for me. Finally, I looked at my father. He was watching me with a look of pure, undisguised contempt. What is the meaning of this, Eliza? Are you trying to cause a scene? You know, Dad, I said, my voice quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. You're right about one thing. I have spent my entire life trying to fill a void. I held up the envelope. I always thought the void was some personal failing of my own. I thought if I just tried harder, if I was more successful, more like James, that I could finally earn your love. I thought I could make you proud. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I bought you a $100,000 car to make you proud. But the truth is, I could have handed you the moon and it wouldn't have been enough. Because the problem isn't with me. It never was. His face darkened with rage. What are you talking about? Have you been drinking? I'm talking about this, I said, and I slowly, deliberately opened the envelope. I pulled out the single sheet of paper. I was curious about our family's ancestry, so I took a DNA test a few months ago, and I found an anomaly. So I did another, more specific test. A paternity test. A collective gasp went through the room. My mother let out a small, strangled sob, her hand flying to her mouth. James shot to his feet. Eliza, that's enough. I ignored him. My eyes were locked on Richard Matthews. You want to talk about blood, Dad? You want to talk about the Matthews instinct? Let's talk about it. According to this certified lab report, the probability of you being my biological father is 0%. I let the paper drop from my fingers. It fluttered down and landed softly on the table next to my untouched dessert. Absolute, deafening silence. It was as if a bomb had gone off and the sound had yet to reach us. Richard's face, which had been flushed with anger, had gone a ghastly, chalky white. He stared at the paper on the table, then at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. For the first time in my life, I saw him completely stripped of his power, his arrogance, his control. He looked small. The spell was broken by my mother. She pushed her chair back violently, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor, and fled the room, her sobs echoing behind her. Sophia, her face pale and streaked with tears, immediately got up and followed her. James stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrified understanding. The harmony he had so desperately wanted to protect was in tatters, and he looked utterly lost. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly strong. I looked at the stunned faces of our guests, the men my father so admired, now staring at him with a new, speculative light in their eyes. The patriarch had been dethroned in his own court. Then I looked at Richard one last time. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He was just staring at that piece of paper on the table, the simple, undeniable truth that had dismantled his entire world. I didn't say another word. I turned, walked out of the dining room, through the grand foyer, and out the front door into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the wreckage of the Matthews family behind me in the rearview mirror. And for the first time in my 32 years, I felt completely, utterly, and blissfully free. The drive back to my hotel was a blur. I don't remember the roads or the traffic lights. All I remember is the feeling of lightness, as if a physical weight I had been carrying on my shoulders my entire life had finally been lifted. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger or sadness. I just felt quiet. When I got back to my room, I saw I had a dozen missed calls. 3 from Sophia, 2 from James, 7 from my mother. I ignored them all and called the one person I wanted to talk to. "Taylor," I said when she picked up on the first ring. "Oh my God, Lisa, what happened? I saw your mom's name pop up on my phone a bunch of times. I knew something was wrong." "I did it," I said, my voice flat. "I told them." You showed him the test. In the middle of dinner. In front of about 20 of his closest friends and business partners. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Taylor let out a low whistle. "Wow, okay. Nuclear fallout. Are you okay?" "I think I am," I said, and the strangest thing happened. I started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh or a hysterical one. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. I feel okay. I feel free. The next few days were quiet. I stayed in Boston, in my hotel room, ordering room service and watching bad movies. I needed the decompression chamber. The calls and texts continued to pour in, a frantic barrage of emotions from my family. Sophia, S were full of concern for me and for our mother. James's were angry and accusatory, blaming me for destroying the family. My mother, S, were just a series of desperate, heartbroken pleas for me to call her. I didn't answer any of them. I needed the silence. I needed to let the dust settle, not just for them, but for me. Finally, on the 3rd day, I texted Sophia back. "I'm okay. I need some time. Please tell Mom I'm not angry at her. I'll call when I'm ready." A week later, back in my own apartment in New York, I was ready. I called my mother. She answered instantly, her voice small and fragile. "Eliza." "Hi, Mom," I said gently. We were silent for a long moment. There were 1,000 questions I wanted to ask, but they didn't seem as important anymore. The who, the when, the why, it was all part of a past I was ready to move on from, but I knew she needed to tell it. "His name was Daniel," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "It was the year before I met your father. I was in college. I loved him. I thought I was going to spend my life with him." Her voice broke. "He was a photographer, a free spirit. He wasn't the kind of man my parents would have ever approved of. He was drafted. Vietnam. He was killed 2 months after he shipped out. I didn't find out I was pregnant until a month after I got the news." I listened silently, my heart aching for the young, terrified girl she must have been. "I was alone," she continued. "My parents would have disowned me. It was a different time. Then I met Richard. He was ambitious, stable, respectable. He offered me a future. He knew about the pregnancy. He agreed to raise you as his own. It was part of the deal. A secret we would take to our graves. But he never let you forget it, did he? I asked softly. A sob caught in her throat. No, never. Every time he looked at you, he saw my failure, my betrayal. He saw Daniel. He punished me for it for 32 years by punishing you. And I let him. I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing the life he gave me that I sacrificed your happiness. Can you ever forgive me, Eliza? In that moment, all the resentment I had ever felt towards her, all the anger at her passivity, it just melted away. She wasn't a weak woman. She was a trapped one. She had made an impossible choice as a scared young girl, and she had been paying the price ever since. There's nothing to forgive, Mom, I said, and I meant it. We were both living in his prison, but we're not anymore. Our relationship didn't magically heal overnight. There was still pain, still decades of complicated history between us. But something had fundamentally shifted. The lies were gone. We could finally start to build something real, something honest. Our conversations became more frequent, more open. She started to stand up for herself in small ways at first. She started taking art classes, something she'd always wanted to do but Richard had dismissed as frivolous. She was finding her voice again. My relationship with Sophia deepened. She became my staunchest ally, a bridge between me and my mother. She understood, in a way no one else could, the complex web of love and obligation and pain that defined our family. James and I are still estranged. He saw my actions not as an act of liberation, but as a betrayal of the family name, the legacy he had inherited. He chose his side. He chose the lie. I feel a sense of sadness for him, for the gilded cage he has chosen to live in, but I can't save him from it. And Richard, I haven't spoken to him since that night. From what Sophia tells me, he is a diminished man. The story of what happened at the dinner party spread like wildfire through their social and business circles. The invincible patriarch had been revealed as a fraud, a cruel man living a lie. The car, my pathetic peace offering, was sold within a month. I heard he told people it had mechanical issues. The irony wasn't lost on me. I never did find out who my biological father was. I think in the end I didn't need to. Knowing who he wasn't was enough. It was the key that unlocked my cage. My life now is quiet. It's my own. My work at the firm continues to be challenging and rewarding, but it no longer defines me. My success is for me now, not for an audience of one who was never even watching. I'm dating someone, a kind, funny architect who loves my ambition and has never once made me feel like I need to be smaller to make him feel big. It's a peaceful, steady kind of happiness. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in my apartment, watching the sun set over the Hudson River, I think about that night. I think about the girl who walked into that house so desperate for a crumb of affection. And I think about the woman who walked out. I didn't go there to destroy my family. I went there to save myself. The void my father created in me isn't a void anymore. It's just empty space. And it's mine to fill with whatever I choose.